Hi, I'm Robert Jacobson, author of Space is Open for Business and founder of Space Advisors. We help organizations develop their strategy for space. Today, we're talking about how you can become a space entrepreneur or an astro-preneur. We're going to be breaking the myths of the trillion-dollar space economy. And number three, what are the mainstream brands that are getting involved with the space economy? Stay tuned.
Welcome to part two of our fabulous interview on leadership and loyalty with Robert Jacobson. He is the founder of Space Advisors. He's a strategic financial consulting firm for space startups. He's got decades, over a decade of experience in this area. He's written a fabulous new book called, wait for it, Space is Open for Business. And he's really talking about how this is going to be a hugely booming economy, and it's going to impact all of us in one way, shape, or another. In fact, the Bank of America expects the space industry to triple to a $1.4 trillion market within a decade. Now, in the last episode, we were talking about, what's going on in this market, and why are people so interested in it. We talked about how there's more technology now than there ever was. Now we want to look at, what does this mean to you? And, is there any sort of practicality to it when it comes down to it? Who is jumping in? Because I want to start here. I remember back in, I think it was 2012. So it's a while ago, almost a decade ago. There was a company created that was pretty high profile. It was backed by people like James Cameron, the filmmaker. Larry Page from Google was involved in it. And it was about, and I even think Bezos got involved in some of it. And even Diamantis got involved in one as well, who we were talking about in part one with SpaceX. And that was around asteroid mining. And then, there was going to be this great asteroid mining. It was going to be low-hanging fruit for metals and all kinds of stuff. And then it disappeared. And with it, I think a lot of people's idea that, maybe it's not an economy that's going to work.
Dob, that's a great example, and thank you for bringing up the company you're sharing is called Planetary Resources Inc. It was co-founded by Dr. Peter Diamandis, well known from the X Prize Foundation, and Eric Anderson, who's a noted space entrepreneur with Space Adventures and worked on, which was taking private space, doing private space travel.
Yep.
And what had happened there was they were able to bring together a very high profile group. The reality is they didn't probably attract enough capital for those individuals. It was kind of a matter of timing. So yes, there was real investment on board, but the effort to actually go do that wasn't, the technology readiness level wasn't there, and it required a lot more capital. And over time, they ended up pivoting, from what I could tell, modifying their own thesis, where they then said, "Hey, we're going to start building satellites to start actually looking back at the Earth to potentially prospect for minerals, and we'll be able to use that technology to prospect for asteroids." And that seemed okay on first blush, but the timing really wasn't. It was a little bit too soon, and they ended up getting acquired by a company called Consensus out of Canada, which is a blockchain company, and it's really not clear how much of the original vision will continue. And another original founder of that was Chris Lewicki, who was an amazing guy, and he still is doing wonderful work, and he was on multiple NASA programs. And I think it sort of shows you that even if you have high profile backers behind you, if the timing's not right and you don't have sufficient capital, no matter who's writing the check, it doesn't really matter, because as it says on the plaque on my brother's boat, he goes, "This boat runs on gas, not thanks."
Yeah.
And let me just back up, and I'll just share one more thing about just my own advisory practices. As much as we love working with space startups, a good part of our practice is actually working with existing organizations interested in a strategy for space, or developing a strategy for space.
Right. So, when I think about that and I go, okay, well, maybe they were a little ahead of the time. So why aren't they doing it now? We're 10, 12 years into the future from when they were originally came together. Is the technology still not there? And is that something that should put off business people and say, well, we'll sit back and we'll wait a while?
I think it's still a matter of some of the technology, because we aren't, we've only done a few asteroid visits, and that's been through government agencies, and it's been highly informative, and they've even done asteroid sample returns. They've got a new mission that's going out to an asteroid now. I think that because the near term economic benefit is still around kind of data in serving Earth, and there's still kind of like the existing resources to take care of, like our electronics manufacturing and this sort of need. Even if we were able to go out to the asteroids, it's unlikely it would make any sense at the moment to bring those resources back for use on Earth. More likely, what is going to happen over the next, call it, I'll say 15 years, or 10 to 20 years, is that those resources, whether they're extracted from the moon or other non-celestial bodies like asteroids, will be used within space for manufacturing and development in space, not necessarily to bring back to Earth. And I think that's an important distinction to make for now, unless just something so cataclysmic happened here on Earth that we're like, okay, full stop, we have to go and mine things from the moon and asteroids to bring back to Earth. But that is, the probability is extremely low.
Yeah, and for me, it's this lovely intersection, and particularly for someone like me who was very fascinated with that, this intersection between science fiction and science fact, because in many science fiction novels, there are manufacturing, quote, plants, and there are minerals and resources that are taken from asteroids, and things are manufactured, inside of these satellite environments, like the space station, using those resources without taking any more away from the Earth. And so, I mean, these possibilities are all there, but it's like, again, let's look at the grounding out of this into the everyday reality. So let's talk about some of the people or some of the companies who have gotten in at that ground floor level now, who, may be very small, maybe not. And let's sort of talk about them first.
Yeah, I think we have to find things that are helpful for us here on Earth, and
Yes.
like what's in our actual terrestrial backyard, because many times, and probably the majority of the time, for a long time, we do things in space to help Earth. And back, you had alluded to into your first part about, even if you're a naysayer, don't want any money being spent on space whatsoever, the reality is we still, as a civilization society, gain countless benefits from the Apollo program that
Yes.
affect our society. And if you want to know where they are, NASA publishes a magazine now, mostly online, called Spinoffs, and I think it's quarterly or twice a year. You can find it, and it lists the new and ongoing spin-offs that just NASA, not even other government agencies or private sector, that are affecting us in so many ways. You might have had a loved one that has had their life literally saved because of this technology that was developed. So for really pennies, the investment back from just government spending on space is really very high. Now, in terms of your current question, where you've kind of charged me saying, what are some actual kind of people doing some entrepreneur things that like we can kind of touch and see? So there's a couple that I've gotten to know. Really, Ian is really the guy that I know better. There's a couple named Ian and Jordana Fitchenbaum, and Ian's from Canada, but he's living in New York City. And Ian and his wife love to bake, and Ian's in the space industry, and they're always, he thinks very entrepreneurially, and they came up with a company called the Zero Gravity Kitchen, or it's the Zero G Kitchen, and I think it's like zero G dot space or zero G dot kitchen, something like that. We can a search will easily turn it up, and they designed and built a space grade, or I should say a space station grade oven that would be able to work in the environment safely of the space station. And they managed to get some early sponsorship customer through DoubleTree. I think it's DoubleTree Hotel. I believe that is. If I got the
Hmm.
hotel wrong, please forgive me. And they did a nice program there. They've got this kitchen, this oven that's still there, and the model is essentially a lease model, I guess, pay per use.
So,
And
so hold on. I want to make sure that people can grasp this because this is lovely,
I
right? So here's some people who like to cook, who have designed an oven that will work in space, not literally in space, but in the space station. And I don't know how that would have to be different, but obviously, there's not going to be a canister of gas to plug it into or something. That
no
wouldn't be
open
good,
flame, no open flame.
and no open flame. that probably wouldn't be a good idea. But they've designed it, and what's more is, from a very entrepreneurial point, they didn't sell it to NASA or to some other place. They've leased it on use to this. Now, again, you know this guy, so I don't. I wonder, is that could sound like that's a multi-million-dollar prototype building type thing to get that in space. Was it?
Apparently, it wasn't.
Right.
Apparently, it was above zero, and I heard less than $1 million, but I think
Wow.
it was much closer to in the thousands. And I don't know, and I've not really asked, but I've kind of heard, that it was not, it took some development work, and it has to go through, it has to be past. You have to be able to fly it there. So
Of
the
course.
whoever flew it, they want to make sure it's safe. There's things that aren't flammable, and it's not
Yeah.
going to hurt astronauts on board. But it was actually done in a sort of a modest way.
See, that's what I want people to grasp here. That yeah, this is ground floor. Absolutely, is ground floor. And I think if you tried to design an oven for space in 10 years from now, of course, the technology will be much better, but it'll probably cost you a lot more just again in logistics and red tape and all kinds of nonsense that you can probably get through quicker these days.
And another company that's a similar example, it is a is there was a company that was started out of two students at the Singularity University, and that's also was co-founded by Dr. Peter Diamandis. And they were trying to find a way, how do we create a bunch of jobs in space, or just do something compelling, affect the world? And they thought, well, manufacturing space is going to be significant. So they created a company called Made in Space. And one of their first
Made in
Made
space.
in Space, just very easy.
Fabulous.
And one of the first things they did is they were funded mostly without, they had very few, and I don't even think they took investment money initially. It was just like revenue contracts from groups like NASA, and they got a 3D printer that was basically kind of like looked more or less like a consumer grade plastic filament.
Right.
They did a deal with Lowe's Hardware, and they sent that to the space station. It was quite successful. And you go, okay, what are you going to do with it there? Well, astronauts were actually able to print some tools that they were able to use, that they
Yes.
didn't have to ship the metal. They brought it back. I think they're building other things, and now the company has been acquired by a private equity group that's going public. It's called, well, I think it's called Redwire, but they're being rebranded. So excuse me, Made in Space was acquired by Redwire, who I think is rebranding, and they're going to try to take that public. And they've acquired several other companies around this manufacturing and space play. But Made in Space is heavily looking at like how are we going to manufacture, and not just manufacture, reuse things and recycle things in space, which I think is very compelling about this idea of reducing space debris, space garbage, if you want to call it, making the use of space more sustainable. And I think that's a kind of a compelling thing. It was just started by two guys, two or three people. And I think it's a really great story in what's going on there.
Yeah. Again, I like the fact that it's a very simple level of how can we get things out into, how can we be part of something? And obviously, like, yeah, we're going to need things in space, and shipping stuff to space is bloody expensive, and of course inconvenient. And if you can manufacture it right there, why wouldn't you? And now we've got 3D printing. That's a fabulous idea.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I,
So, um, you were telling me, we were talking earlier, you and I in the break, about large organizations who are maybe having a little bit of foresight and saying, this is the future. Um, can you tell us about some of the larger companies who are jumping into this space economy, who understand the value of it, and maybe an expenditure level, and maybe putting some R&D money into it, and then saying, because this is the future, like you talked about with NASA, we're living with the fruits of that today. And some of these companies are actually recognizing, yeah, we might have to put some chunks in, but the repercussions beneficially are vast.
yeah. So I'll first talk about a company that everyone knows called Google or Alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
And the founders, at least one of the founders, was very bullish on space and was backing all sorts of kind of space related initiatives and making sure that there was they backed the Google Lunar X Prize. They acquired a satellite provider that eventually was reacquired by the company Planet. They had a lot of deep interest and it made sense. They had Google Maps, and they started thinking, gosh, if we had our own hardware up there and we start having maybe closer to real time data, how does this all fit in? Ultimately, I believe that when the founders left, that the sort of the new leadership was probably just more focused on core businesses. And one day
Mm-hmm.
you might see them going back to buying and leveraging space. But at the moment, they're not like heavily investing like capex into things that are like hardware expensive. They also had a project called Loom, which was trying to use high altitude platforms to provide internet access to space. So I think they're always observing this. And even Google headquarters in Mountain View is actually basically on leased land or adjacent to leased land, which is at NASA Ames. And so NASA Ames is one of the NASA centers, and it's in Silicon Valley. And by strategically having their headquarters there, they have all this access to all this kind of like great R&D and insights coming out of NASA just by geographic
Right.
proximity. They're like right there, which I think is interesting. Now, a more current contemporary company that's actively tracking and taking is interested is DHL, the global logistics company.
So for those who for a moment are going, DHL, hold on a minute, isn't that like FedEx? Isn't that like deliveries? So we're sending packages from Amazon using DHL. Like how, that might be a bit of a mind blower for a minute.
Yeah, and right now, so if you're say, let's just say let's say you're a researcher, whether in academia or in the commercial market, that maybe you had a project on the space station. The U.S. part of the space station is designated a U.S. national laboratory, and almost every trip to and from the space station, there is cargo delivered to and from, whether it's being delivered by companies such as SpaceX or the Japanese or Europeans or the Russian. They take cargo, and they
Yep.
have to sometimes bring it back. Well, once it gets back to Earth, it still has to get back to that lab for processing or
Mm-hmm.
whatever else, and it's using logistics providers like DHL, who will carry and transport that back. And if you're developing one of these larger systems, maybe you're at an organization building, say, spacecraft, you're using some of these companies anyways. So it was not really a surprise when an organization such as DHL started to say, okay, what is how are we currently integrated in the aerospace industry, aviation and space? And how is it further extending out where one day we're doing, we've got, there's both robotic and human presence on places like private space stations, commercial space stations, and the moon. There's probably going to be some logistics involved. and that's where they're interested. So a couple areas that DHL's doing is, one, they have just kind of their own kind of technology, or I should say a trends radar, and space is one of the trends that they're tracking. And they have a mission that they've sponsored with the private lunar carrier company Astrobotic, of which the group Arc Mission Foundation that I work with, we're one of their customers. And on their maiden mission on their Peregrine lander, DHL is deeply involved. They have like this branded thing called the DHL Moonbox, and they are part of the this lunar mission. So DHL is, put their footprint in it'll be in a big symbolic way when they head to the moon in the next 10 to 12 months within that time frame.
So
Probably sooner.
there's another piece here, and I realize this. What we're talking about here is way outside of the reach of a traditional entrepreneur. But I mean, just think about this at this simple level. Let's just say DHL decide that their signature thing is "we deliver." Let's just say that, right? We deliver, and then there's a picture of the moon box on the moon. Like, is there any better branding? Is there any better leverage? Is there, like, how many news stories can you get out of that, right? So whatever you spent is coming back to you in large multiples by virtue of that. Let's just tap into that brand. That's, talk about Super Bowl. Like super what?
So when they have their landing, let's revisit that conversation.
Yeah, because
It'll
it's
be
a very, I mean, this is one of the things that people don't understand, is the leverage of things that are not direct, like we talked about with the things like from NASA. And one of the examples you talked to me about was, and we see this again, it's in all the sci-fi movies, but there's always a doctor on board, not for the astronauts, but she's doing research. They're looking at what happens in space with mice or rats or with this pharmaceutical. You were telling me about an example of that with Merck.
Yeah, so Merck, the pharmaceutical company, they develop pharmaceuticals, biologics. Some of these things have different shelf life issues. One of their drugs, pharmaceuticals, Keytruda, a well-known cancer drug, it was an intravenous drug, and drug companies are always trying to find ways, can we extend the patent life so it can make more money on the drug, or increase the market. Well, they interestingly flew Keytruda a number of times to space, and they ended up doing a reformulation, creating an injectable, and it increased the market share by billions of dollars. Now, space wasn't the only part of it. They were doing other things on Earth too, but it was part of this reformulation strategy, and it is like their most successful drug. It is one of the most successful drugs out there. And it's pretty important,
But aside from the monetization of it, which is obvious,
yeah,
but it's probably saving people's lives at a much greater rate because of the accessibility of being able to, instead of it having to be,
instead of sitting there in a chair for hours. So you make your cancer appointment, and maybe you're on your phone or whatever, but you're still sitting there for several hours getting your treatment. If you're able to potentially get it in a half an hour rather than 5 hours, that's such a big quality of life that you get back yet.
Yes.
That's almost example and represent when people who are against certain types of automation, I say, look, would you rather be, we could still be on the factory line, pressing out coffee tins, and, there are other things that we get to do because of automation. So I'm actually one who's sort of a high proponent of, if there are things that allow us to spend more time with a loved one, or just do what we want to do here and now, because today is such a gift, I am all for that adoption of that technology, even if there's some near-term pain that in any technology transition sometimes can occur.
Yeah, and I think the reason I wanted to have you on is because I know psychologically human beings are resistant to change. And as I always say in my presentations, we all love change as long as we don't have to. Right? So we want the technology that will give us all the change, but we don't want to actually have to be inconvenienced or put up with any level of pain. But all change actually demands pain, but for you to get the fruits of it. And the only question is, are you willing to embrace that? Right?
Yeah, very exactly.
So, as we're coming towards the end of part two of our show here, I there's a question I always like to ask, which is, what is something practical that our people, our viewers, our listeners can go away and think about how to apply some of the messaging that you've shared with us today, preferably in the next 24 hours. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but something that will make it more real for them that they can put into action right away.
Okay. I tend to work both on intuitive and analytics, but what feels right at the moment is just go to NASA spinoffs and look at one of the categories, and they have it categories. It's like water, environment. They have all these different categories. Just pick one of the categories, and just look at that for 30 seconds or 5 minutes, and you will probably find several pieces of new thing going, gosh, I did not know that space provided that, and that's super valuable to me as a human being, like almost critical. And I think even just understanding that, and I think that the second thing would be think about your own, whatever you do. I don't care if you're like, I don't care what your position, what your perceived position is in life, but whatever you feel your expertise or passion is, sometimes there can be a little different, but whatever that is, take a look at that and see, is there a way to imprint or superimpose space on that? Space plus dishwashing, space plus branding, space plus insurance, whatever that is. And just think about those things. And you might have a little bit of cognitive dissonance for a moment and going, oh, that hurts. I don't feel that. But play with that thought exercise for a moment, and you might discover something that might be very impactful and a kind of maybe a catalyst.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you, Robert. So as we finish up the show, I would love for you to tell our viewers and our listeners where they can find out more about you, the book, and any of your resources.
Yeah, so to learn more about get all sorts of space updates and what's going on this week in sort of the space news, go to my personal website, Robert Jacobson. That's SON, robertjacobson.com. All things about my book with a nice membership portal with extra benefits at spacesopenforbusiness.com, and available widely in independent stores and the big online retailers. And then my advisory practice to help organizations on their strategy for space and select high growth startups is spaceadvisors.com. And also on the you can find me Twitter, 62 Mile Club, Robert C. Jacobson on Instagram, Robert C. Jacobson on LinkedIn. I'm happy to kind of connect with people where they're comfortable.
Fabulous. Well, we'll make sure, of course, that we share all of those links and on the show notes. But before we go, just one last little thing, and that is, what's your superpower?
I think my superpower is probably I'll go with my wife. My wife tells me it's my ability to follow up and follow through. That's what my wife tells me, and I can't go wrong with what she knows all of my all the shadows and all my brilliance.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, that's actually very good advice. You'll follow up and you follow through.
Yeah, so if you do reach out so if you reach out to me, I'll write. I do write everyone back. So
fabulous. Thank you. Appreciate that, Robert. And for you, dear listener, of course, And for you, dear listener, of course, we'll post all of the links to how you can connect with Robert and his book. And remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes in our Facebook groups. Just go to the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. You can also find us on LinkedIn. And if we always need your helping stay relevant. So please, wherever, if you can just go rate, review, and subscribe to the show, it always helps. Because it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or your organization, you can find out more at dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified, actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you can maybe tap into the fact that space is open for business for you. I'm Dov Baron, and I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.